Hey up and welcome to the Strategy Sessions. Andy Jarvis with you here. I'm the host of the show and the Strategy Director at Eximo Marketing. Thank you for joining us today. It's Season 2, Episode number 2, 22. Both are twos, two little ducks. Interesting fact for you. Not very interesting, really. I used to be a bingo caller. That's why two little ducks, quack, quack, all that sort of stuff just sticks in there, right in the head, and you can never get rid of it. But also a great job if you're 16, 17, 18 and like talking like me. Well, it's a great job. Anyway, you're not here to listen to me talk about my old jobs and being a bingo caller. You're here to listen to the guest today. Today's guest is a chap called Simon Bridge. Simon is a visiting professor at Ulster University. He runs a consultancy specialising in enterprise and entrepreneurship. I first met Simon at university, where he was lecturing. I talk a little bit about that in the show, so I won't retell that story. And was really, really impressed with how he pulls apart government policy, how he looks at what we do right and what we do wrong when we're talking about entrepreneurship, and even looking back at what is the point of a company? What are we asking people to do when we're looking at starting companies? Is it to save the economy, or is it just to live a life that they're more interested in? Some really, really interesting points in this. So if you're an entrepreneur, if you run your own business, if you're interested in enterprise as a sector, really worth listening to today. Some of the points that Simon makes actually apply to a lot of businesses anyway, whether you run your own or not. And also, one of the things that Simon does really, really well is he uses stories from other parts of industry, other sectors entirely, to bring it to life. Listen out for the story about George Washington and what that means for entrepreneurship, which I think is fantastic. And towards the end, he talks about what we can learn from plants and when and how they grow, which again is just a wonderful analogy because it helps to bring it to life for you. Entrepreneurs, people who run small businesses listening to this podcast, I'd be remiss of me not to tell you about the course that I have with the University of Vaasa in Finland. Obviously, I don't speak English. I don't speak Finnish. Sorry, you might say I don't speak English. But yes, it's online, 100% remote, and it's kind of a build your own marketing strategy course. So you can watch the modules whenever it suits you. Learn along as you go, but also while you're doing it, create your own marketing strategy. It's ideal really for small business owners, entrepreneurs, people in growing businesses, people who've never really been open to strategy before or really exposed to it and had to do it themselves. How do you create a marketing strategy? I don't know. I have to do it. Have a look at this course. It's €249. It runs on the Teachable platform, so you can access it wherever you need to do. And I would really love you to download it, get involved with it, and give it a go. If you want to do that, there's a link in the show notes. Just click that, University of Vaasa. It's on Teachable. Sort it out from there. Right, that's enough from me. Let's go and listen to Simon Bridge. We spoke a couple of weeks ago, and Simon will tell you all about enterprise and entrepreneurship and bring all that story to life for you. Thanks very much for listening. If you like the show, please share it. Tag me on social media at Andy Jarvis, Andy with an I. So it's ANDI JARVIS. Tag me on Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever you are. Drop that in, and it'd be lovely to hear from you, to hear what you think of the show. Anyway, here we go. Simon Bridge. Simon Bridge, welcome to the Strategy Sessions.
Thank you.
So Simon is on the show today because we met probably 6 or 7 years ago now. I was studying for my MSc in marketing. So I've got an undergrad degree, which was 3 years, a part-time MSc, which was a couple of years, and I've just finished a mini MBA in marketing. And I can honestly say that in all those periods of study, probably 6 years of study in total, there is one lecture I remember, and that lecture was delivered by Simon Bridge. I was at Ulster University, and Simon, you explain why were you at Ulster University that day delivering a lecture?
Well, thank you very much for saying that, Andy. I suppose it's a slightly long story, but back at the beginning of the 1980s, 1984, I was asked if I was interested in a new job. I was working in the shipyard at the time and not getting very far, and it wasn't going anywhere. And the job came up in a small business agency that then existed. It was called LEDU, Local Enterprise Development Unit. It doesn't exist now. It was wound up when Invest in I was created, but they wanted a new program director, and I was asked if I was interested in applying for it. And I thought, well, I hadn't been working in small businesses, but I did do a small business option at business school, and I need a new job. So I said yes. So I found myself in this government-funded agency supporting small businesses in Northern Ireland. From that, after a short while, the then Department of Economic Development was revising its strategy, I suppose. And one of the things it was looking at is a number of issues in Northern Ireland. It had about 6 of them, and there was a task force for each one. One of the issues they said was enterprise. They're saying we need more of it, whatever that meant. But I was asked if I'd chair that task force. So I was then, in a sense, starting to think, what do we mean by enterprise, and how do we get more of it? And we didn't know, so we asked around. We came up with some initial ideas. We started to experiment. Some of the things were introduced into policy, but I suppose what happened is personnel at the top of the organizations changed. Lead use focus became slightly more production oriented, maximize small business we were helping through grants and the jobs they promised. Some of the exploration of enterprise wasn't as interesting for them. I left the agency. I was still interested in that, but I felt that it wasn't going that direction then. So I became self-employed, working in this area, continued to be interested in it. I'd known some people at University of Ulster, two others there, and myself. We wrote a book about enterprise. We said, look, in those days, this is mid-1990s by then, if you ask for a book about small business, you'll get a book about how to start a small business. You'll struggle to find a book that tells you about them. So we thought we could write one like that. So we produced this book we called Understanding Enterprise, and we said Understanding Enterprise, Entrepreneurship and Small Business to explain what it was about. It sold quite well, and the publishers came back to us quite quickly and said, look, it's selling as a textbook. Could you do a new edition and make it more of a textbook? So we did that. To cut that long story short, the last edition we produced was the 5th edition, and we'd made some significant changes, partly because through my work, through trying to write about it and things like that, I was still attending academic conferences because I was still interested. I'd come to think about some of the things I thought I'd picked up early on weren't really correct. And so, for instance, in the book, we in the last edition, we had a section at the beginning about this is what people are saying about enterprise and small business. Then we had a section about where we think that's wrong. And finally, funnily enough, we had a section about why government is interested, what government does to support it, and a chapter on does that government support work. And in each of the 5 editions, consistently, we have said we can't find the evidence that the government action works, which says something about the ideas on which it's based. Mm-hmm. So that confirmed, at least in my mind, we need to look at those ideas. So as I said, I've been working with people in the University of Ulster. I've been doing some work, for instance, on the initiative they had called NICENT. And as a result, they made me a visiting professor and asked me occasionally to give a lecture. Hence, I was lecturing to the marketing MSCs.
And there we were. Now, I remember, and I've told you this before, Simon, so this isn't news to you. I remember, if you don't know Belfast, if you're listening from outside of Northern Ireland, you might not know Belfast is a real tech hub. Dublin is probably the biggest tech hub on the island of Ireland, but Belfast is a real thriving, vibrant tech centre. A lot of people wearing T-shirts, hoodies and trainers, raising venture capital from San Francisco, bringing it into Northern Ireland. And I think when I'd looked down the module list of entrepreneurship, I was expecting somebody from one of these tech firms to be coming in and telling us. And Simon walked in, and my first lesson was, don't judge a book by its cover, judge Simon by what comes out of his mouth, which was just mind-blowing at the time. And I think what Simon talked about that day, and what we'll dive into a little bit more, is this element of government policy, because you currently, you just finished a PhD looking at this as well. And I think it started, what kind of got me to sit to the end of my seat was, you started off by explaining government policy and then pulled it apart piece by piece to explain why it wasn't working or what misconceptions it was built on. And also just the fact that it was built on sort of received wisdom as opposed to actual fact. So, do you want to dive into that a little bit? And where are the areas and problems that you see with government policy on entrepreneurship?
Yes, there's a number of things follow from that. I suppose people might say, look, if government have been working at this for quite a while, why is it, and a lot of people are doing academic research on it, why isn't the two have come together and policy is now much better? And I think unless you really study how policy is made in these circumstances and actually get involved in it, you don't really appreciate there's actually a big gap between the two. There are lots of reasons for this, actually. Often, for instance, if you've read the book, again, Northern Ireland book, Burned, about the recent renewable heat initiative scandal, makes clear, I mean, it talks about that particular bit of the government department responsible for that initiative. In the space of about 6 months, most of the people of that had changed. People move in and out and get promoted, and no one stays long enough really to build up an expertise in an area. So you get people who are there for a short term, picking up, suddenly being asked to, oh, we need new policy, don't have time to research it, they've got to run with what they know about. Often you get strange influences. In particular, people are lobbying, got the minister's ear or something, that could be very influential. And funnily enough, researchers probably are trying to learn about small businesses, how they operate, what they're like, whereas policy wants to know how to influence them. And that's a slightly different thing. In a different field, I was reading one person who said, he explained it. He said it's a little bit, his analogy was cows and butter. He said, you don't blame the cow for not producing butter. Cows are very useful for producing the milk, but producing the butter then requires a different process. You need both, and you don't blame the cow for not going the whole way. So I think policymakers haven't been prepared to take what policy can tell them, which isn't exactly what they want to know, and turn it into. So in a sense, it's not actually strange that policy keeps going. And again, in the government system, there are periodic reviews of things, find things that are going wrong. And if they find something that's going wrong, the person responsible is questioned heavily about why are you doing this? So the incentive is not to be found to do something wrong. And the way to avoid that is to keep doing the same thing or to copy recognized best practice from elsewhere. It's not to do something new. Because you don't really get praise for getting something right, but you will be criticized for getting something wrong. And so, first of all, you try and do more of the same. And secondly, you try and control what's said about it. So any stories that from your side are released about it are positive. You can manage not to know it's going wrong. Donald Rumsfeld very famously talked about the known unknowns, the things we know we don't know. What he didn't mention is the other way around. The unknown knowns, the things we could know if we wanted to, but we've managed to avoid knowing because we don't want to know them.
That sounds like a great description of government.
So I think that inevitably that's what happens there. So I think it's not surprising that policy is there, not being able to correct itself. It's only a few people from outside. And as I say, all the programs are evaluated. I mean, it's clear policy, you must evaluate a program. But if you pay someone to do the evaluation for you, they are going to want to produce a positive report so they can get invited to do it again. So there's a big incentive to produce positive reports in that situation. It's only when you've got people from outside impartially looking at it, which is very rare, then you start to say, hang on, where is the real evidence of success?
I find it, people assume research is always impartial, which is often far from the truth. And I'll put a link in the show notes to an article I read about hand dryers that you find in toilets. And there's two schools of research. One school of research tells you that hand dryers are the least hygienic thing in the world ever, and all they do is blow fecal matter around the toilet. And other things will tell you they are infinitely more hygienic and better for the environment than using paper towels. Amazingly, all the things that say hand dryers are terrible are funded by the Paper Towel Association of America or Scott and people who make paper towels, and all the studies that show how terrible they are, and vice versa. Well, That's amazing, isn't it? How those two studies keep showing different things. So research isn't always impartial, is it? I think that's a key takeaway.
No, not at all. Because even academic researchers, ultimately, a lot of the funding for that comes from government. So there is an understandable incentive to try and please the person who's ultimately providing the funding. I'm afraid that's inevitable. Yeah.
So where did this start? So we started in the 50s, 60s, and 70s with almost full employment. Unemployment started to grow in sort of mid 70s, and that's where the sort of push for entrepreneurial and people starting businesses and things like that came from. Is that right? And how has that sort of rolled forward?
The history of this, commentators have said the first university course in entrepreneurship possibly was just very late 1930s in Japan. But the second mention is about 1948, 1949 in Harvard. In 1940, it does seem that in America, some academic interest was being given to this area. But I also saw a report that even by the 1970s, it was a minority interest, although another commentator said it was starting to grow in the 70s. But as Andy said, in many countries, unemployment, for whatever reason, started to rise in the 1970s. And it was by the end of that decade, it became obvious to a number of governments, look, the economy isn't performing the way it has been doing for about 30 years. And they get worried about where they're going to find new jobs. And it was in 1979 that an American researcher called David Birch released the results of his studies, which said, where you get net new jobs, i.e. a net increase in jobs, it's from small businesses. People have thought big businesses are the mainstay of the economy. And he was saying, no, in his study, big businesses lost as many jobs as they created. Where you got an increase in jobs, it was from small businesses. Now, some people queried that at the time. Funnily enough, people are still questioning whether he was absolutely right. Some people, for instance, say it was new businesses rather than small businesses. But at the time, I think governments, weren't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. If it looks at small businesses rather than jobs, they wanted to know about small businesses and how to get more of them. So, and when governments get interested like that, there are budgets. So you had money available for governments to support businesses and learn about, and other people to learn about them. So I think you've got an industry, which I use the word enterprises encompassing entrepreneurs, small businesses, etc. A sort of enterprise industry growing up, and I say largely government funded. So that's when interest suddenly started. And another result of that is because the interest was suddenly there. The governments didn't say, in 20 years' time, we'd like to know this. They said, we want to know now. So people were putting together very quickly what they thought they knew. They didn't have time to do lots of new research about it. So you got a number of assumptions made, people trying to note what they knew, and that was then passed on to the next generation, as you say, almost as fact, not as yet untested assumptions, but almost this is what we know about this, and people received it as fact, and that sort of, I think, became passed on. So hurriedly assembled. Funnily enough, as in almost any field of study, it starts with some guesses and some assumptions. It ought to be tested, but in this case, I don't think it was.
So there's a story you told, sort of, which connects to this, which is how George Washington died, which is kind of connected to this and rolls back a couple of thousand years from that. Do you want to explain what that?
Let me explain that. Yes, I've used an analogy from medicine because it seems to me if you look at another subject, you can be slightly more impartial about it. What we know about George Washington's death, I think it was 1799. He, in December, I think it was, he'd been out on his horse in some very nasty weather. He got a very sore throat and then developed a fever. And in those days, the cure for fever was bleeding. And it is recorded that his doctors bled him. And the first time they bled him, it didn't work. He still had the fever. So they bled him again. And again, the record is that over a period of about 10 hours, they must have taken about half his blood out of him. And 2 days after the onset of fever, he was dead. Modern medical opinion, I think, would say he had inflammation of the epiglottis, but they also say that bleeding certainly didn't help, and probably that was what killed him.
And these would have been the smartest doctors in America at the time, looking for George Washington.
This idea of bleeding people, it comes apparently from a theory developed by the Hippocratic doctors in ancient Greece, who had deliberately said, we're not going to rely on witch doctors and priests for medicine, as a lot of people had done. We're going to observe patients and try and learn from them. And from their observation of people, they put together a theory that said, in the human body, there are 4 humours. These are liquids. There's a clear humour which comes out as spit or sweat or something. There's a red humour, blood. There's a black bile, and there's a yellow bile. And for instance, they observed that soldiers injured in battle, lost a lot of blood. They got cold and they got dry. So they thought all the humours have different properties. Blood has the property of making you hot and wet. And they also developed the idea that when you get ill, it's because the humours are not in balance. So you need to restore the balance, and then you'll get better. And if blood makes you hot and wet, and with a fever you're too hot and wet, you must have too much blood. So you can restore the balance by removing blood. And that's what teaching was rediscovered from Arabic sources, actually. And that's what in George Washington's time, that's what medical schools were teaching. That's what doctors were being taught. That's what patients expected. Mm-hmm. And funnily enough, a lot of them got better. Now, modern medical opinion would say a lot of them are going to get better anyhow. And you've got the placebo effect in there, of course. Yeah. If you think that the treatment is doing you good, it in effect can have a positive benefit. But modern medical opinion says the bleeding was the wrong theory. But it's interesting, a lot of sensible people believed it because it had a good pedigree. Mm-hmm. And it was only, I believe that one of the reasons people started to question it. Once we had microscopes and could observe the capillaries which joined the arteries to the veins, people could observe that blood circulated. And once blood started to see its circulation, then people asked why, and then saw it as a different sort of humor. It doesn't just sit in one place. And so started to see it was doing other things. And once they start to see this, then they start to realize, it's not something which we want to lose like that. But nevertheless, George Washington does appear to have been killed because of theory based on a false assumption.
And those, so taking that then and jumping back to enterprises in the modern day, what are some of the false assumptions that are used to help, in inverted commas, to help new businesses grow?
Well, my suggestion is we've built a nest of assumptions. I don't think we did it consciously, but I think these explain how we've come to think about this area. And we're talking about the area of entrepreneurs and small businesses. I think almost the starting assumption, we've treated enterprise as if it was a subset of the field of business. Mm-hmm. Not, I think, surprising people have made that assumption because they were interested in it because they were talking about small businesses mm-hmm. and their job creation. So you've got the word business in there. The evidence that they thought about this, where we put this, when we study it, we put it in business schools. And, we promote it through business agencies. But I think when that happened, what we did said, okay, business schools, you'll do enterprise is part of business, you deal with it. But if you think about it, what business schools fundamentally teach and what most business professionals learn. By business professional, I mean academics, consultants, accountants, managers of big businesses. Essentially, they learn from a big business model. They're not conscious that small businesses are different. They're not conscious we've learned a model which is really only applicable to big businesses. They've learned that's how businesses work. So now we put small businesses alongside this, and we think they are small big businesses, instead of realizing they're not. So we start to apply, I think, fundamentally big business thinking. And I think three things I would suggest come from that. I think a lot of big businesses, because that's what their shareholders want, they're trying to maximize their profits. And in order to do that, they want to grow as big as they can to make money for their shareholders. So we sort of assume that applies to all businesses. The second thing, I think we've assumed that in this world of business, we understand it well, so we can sort of, with appropriate market research, predict how things are going to happen. Funny enough, a way of thinking which is prominent in the West, almost from the time of Newton, that if we're clever enough, we can work out the mechanism behind things and then see how it's going to work in the future. So we come to believe that we can, with the right sort of research from, I say, market researchers or economists, determine what's going to happen and plan on that basis. So we've got big business planning as the essential for directing your business. And the third thing I think we've assumed, and it's there written down in the textbooks, in economic textbooks, the assumptions of traditional economics, that human beings in these areas act rationally to maximize their benefit. So we've assumed that decisions we've made on logic, which means we have not allowed for social influence on how people act in this area. So I think those are a set of assumptions which you can see why they were made, but I can go through each one if you want and say why I think they're wrong.
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, the first one you mentioned about that big business thinking is something I come across on a regular basis when I look at marketing strategy with organizations. So a lot of strategy is driven from, it's a military term, and we'll maybe talk about that later, and it was kind of codified and written down post First World War, when a lot of the US military demobbed and went to work at places like Ford and General Motors and things like that. You know, I've never worked with a company directly anyway that is the size or scope of Ford or General Motors, yet they all have been fed that they have to plan in a very deliberate, strategic way, the same way that Ford and GM do. Yet I'm working with a company with maybe 150 employees with a turnover of 25 million. And you think, well, why do you need to plan that way? Because it worked for them. So that's an assumption that I see fairly regularly. So let's look at those. So the first one, I suppose, then is the profit assumption. That everybody's business is designed to make the most profit possible for shareholder return. That is true or not true of small businesses, or is it there's a shade of grey?
I think probably if people really think about it, they might realize it's not true. But I think because we assume it's true, we don't bother to think about it. In the book I referred to earlier, we did talk about two different views of business. We're contrasting the professional view and the owner's view. And I think the professional, therefore, is saying if the business is not maximizing its profit potential, it's not doing very well. But if you look at we're talking about small businesses, often run by the owner, what is the business doing for them? Often it's supporting a lifestyle. Yes, the business could grow bigger, but do they want to incur the bother of a bigger business? We used to talk about the BMW syndrome, that it was noticeable that a number of businesses, you could really see it if you looked for it. The owner wanted the business to do sufficiently well that he could drive a prestigious car like a BMW. But once the business was doing well enough for him to afford a BMW, he didn't want to double its size and have two BMWs because he couldn't drive two of them. Once you were there, you got what you wanted. You didn't need to go further. And now that's just one aspect. There are lots of other things people want out of businesses, but often the person who runs small businesses, it's to fit in with the local community. It's possibly to employ a group of people from maybe from the local community or other people. It's to support your lifestyle. It's not to really grow the business as fast as it will grow. And funnily enough, a book by Geoffrey West called Scale, which I recommend to people, one of the things he looks at is how things in life, he used the word scale because he says it's actually the wrong word. What happens when they try to get bigger? He looks at organizations like animals, he looks at cities, and he looks at businesses. And he actually says the bigger they get, the more they limit their life. The very few very large businesses last for more than, maximum 100 years. But he says in a number of places, Japan, for instance, Western Europe, etc., you can identify quite a few businesses that have lasted several hundred years, which don't fit the normal pattern. Mm-hmm. And what they have in common seems to be they didn't try and grow big. They found a niche and delivered against that niche very well.
Right.
And we're content to do that. So actually growing and just trying to maximize profit limits the life of the business.
Yeah. Okay. And
it's not necessarily what the owners want. If you really look at that, but a lot of people don't. And even I suspect, if you ask a number of owners, if you're doing it on an official basis, they probably think I ought to want to make profit. So they probably try and repeat that to whoever's asking them as the expected answer.
But if you dive a little bit deeper, maybe there's other reasons why they're doing that business.
Yeah, I think, but often it's one of those things you can't get at through the direct question.
Yeah.
Because asking the question shapes how people are going to frame their answer.
Yeah, you need very, very good field research almost, don't you, for that, and focus groups and the like to dive into that. And I'm really interested in the next one about determinism and the ability to predict the future based on great planning, because it hurts my head when I meet people who think in this way that you can deliver perfect inputs, so then we can deliver we can predict exactly what the outputs are going to be next year. And you're like, but how do we know what our competitors are going to spend? How do we know if they, how do we know all these things? We don't. So
no, and I think determinism has been criticized. People thought physics was a clear example of a science that believed in this. Mm-hmm. But one commentator, interesting, point out, actually physics has moved away from it. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle says that whereas we thought if we could look at every atom and where it was, we could work out what was going to happen. And Heisenberg says you can't know where they are and where they're going. You can know one or the other. So this commentator said, physics has abandoned the idea, but the social sciences haven't.
We're always behind the curve, aren't we, as social scientists?
Yes. Most predictions are based on extrapolations from current trends. Mm-hmm. And history shows us current trends don't last for very long. Sooner or later, and usually sooner, something happens to upset them. So I suggest instead of this belief in determinism, and funnily enough, again, I've seen advertising that says, if you're starting a business, you need a business plan. And I've seen business plans described as roadmaps to the future. But think about it. To have a roadmap, someone has to have been in the territory and explored it. They have to have surveyed it. They have to have been there and built roads through it. And they have to have mapped the roads so you can have a roadmap. The future is unknown. We haven't done any of that. How can we have a roadmap for it? Mm-hmm. So instead, I think in these areas, we should learn how to deal with the uncertain, the unpredictable. But we're taught how to plan, not how to prepare for uncertainty. And I think if we want to do that, there are a number of useful pointers. Again, if you want me to go into that a bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because I think this is it'd be really fascinating for people about preparing for uncertainty is something that they don't, I'm not aware of anyone teaching that. How do you prepare for uncertainty when we're supposed to plan and know exactly what's happening day by day by day? So.
Well, a starting point for that is a book by Tim Harford called Adapt. And his theme of that was almost everything that works well in this world has been the result of trial and error. At least that's the word we use for it. Really, it's not error. It's trial, observe the reaction, feedback of what's not working well, improve. And if anyone really wants to carry around the first mobile phone or drive the first car or fly in the first airplane, I don't think they'd find it a very a comfortable experience. All those things got better essentially through trial and error. So essentially trial and error is saying, no, you can't work out exactly the reaction to something. The only way to find out the reaction is to test, suck it and see, test it. So you test it as early and cheaply as you can. You don't try to perfect it and then test it. The lean startup technique is about, as soon as you've got something, a reasonably working prototype, test it on the market, because you will be surprised of which bits the market likes and which it doesn't like. There's a couple of other techniques that talk about at least concepts. There's a book by Nassim Taleb, who's more famous for writing a book called The Black Swan. Black swans for him were the unexpected things that upset predictions, because he said, we in Europe knew for certainty that all swans were white until someone went to Australia and came back with a black one. So to him, the black swan is the thing that upsets your certain knowledge. But he wrote another book called Anti-Fragile. And he invented that word because he said, I want, he said, a lot of people say the opposite of fragile is robust. But if you think about it, if you handle something fragile and you handle it roughly, it's liable to be damaged. If you have something robust and you handle it roughly, it's liable to be unchanged. He wanted a word for when you handle it roughly, it gets stronger as a result. And you don't do that by insulating yourself from what's going on. It's like trial and error. You expose it to this and improve it because of the feedback.
Fragile, brilliant.
And one little expression to summarize all that possibly I came across is the expression ready, fire, aim. Because most people have heard the expression ready, aim, fire, which is when you're shooting a rifle, you get ready, you line the rifle up exactly on where you need to be, because once you squeeze the trigger, you have no further control over the bullet. But life isn't like a rifle bullet. Life is like a guided missile, where it's ready, fire, aim. Get ready, get going, and then steer it onto the target. So planning is all about ready, aim, fire. Life is ready, fire, aim.
Brilliant. And if we had more of that in enterprise culture and in business support, that might lead to more successful and healthier businesses.
Yeah. And another writer about this has been Sarah Sarasvathy, her book Effectuation. I mean, one of the things they said there is the successful entrepreneurs she studied, when they sought a new venture, how much money were they going to put into it? They didn't do a business plan to find out how much investment they needed. They worked out how much they could afford to lose. They didn't want to lose it. They said, it may not work. If that much I can manage, I can survive. So that's as far as I'm going to go in investing in it. So again, that's a way of exploring. I suggest that a lot of new small ventures have much more in common with explorers and big businesses. They don't know exactly what's going to happen. The only way is to get out there and see, but you try and do it in a safe way so that if it doesn't work, you can get back.
Yeah. So that's I think you talked about that before in terms of having to make a small jump for some of the best enterprises to get off the ground. You have to make a small jump, but not a jump that might lose you your house or bet too much. But there always is a jump. There's a gap that you have to cover at some point.
Yes. And she talked about them. One of the ways to do it is to find partners. You might find a supplier or a customer who's very interested in this and might do it with you. As one way. But she felt that these people who she looked at had taken businesses to say to stock market flotation, and that's how they tend to think about it.
Yeah. No, fascinating stuff. Fascinating. And so lastly, tell us a little bit more about economists believing that everybody behaves rationally. when hopefully most social scientists by now are fully aware that we are completely irrational, but predictably irrational, I think is the name of the book.
Well, it's interesting. Daniel Kahneman, who got a Nobel Prize for economics, really for behavioral economics, he was a psychologist. And he said, as a trained psychologist, he once saw a list of the assumptions made by traditional economists. And he says, as a psychologist, I was trained to disbelieve all of them. And I think what we've done is assumed rational thought all the time. We've ignored social influence. Mm-hmm. But if you really think about it, and people who studied human behavior say, yeah, we are such a social species, we don't realize how much we are subject to social influence. But most of the things we do because other people around us are doing it or encouraging it. Mark Earls wrote a book about this called Herd, as in the herd instinct. It's again a very interesting book, which I read because I heard him interviewed on the radio. And the one quote I took from the radio interview, he says, "Independent thinking is to humans as swimming is to cats. They can do it if they have to." And I usually ask my audiences, how many people have seen a cat swim? And very people put their hand up.
Yeah.
So we don't realize how much what we do is actually social influence. Why do we buy that particular car? Because other people are buying it. Mm-hmm. Not because it's logically the best car for us, for instance.
It's fascinating. I go to a lot of business events, or I did pre-COVID, and hopefully will in the next few weeks and months as well. And when you go into the car park of these business events, every businessman and businesswoman drives exactly the same car. You know, it's a sea of Audi A4s, BMW 3 and 5 Series, and occasionally you see something a little bit different, but it's just a sea of sameness of. And you're thinking, how does everybody think differently when they all dress and look and behave the same?
I think it was Mark Earls in his book. At one point he said he'd been hired to do some market research on the owners of Series 3 BMWs, and he said, three sort of comments he made in his interviews with them. He said they all dress the same. It's as if the book came with a style handbook. The car. It said this is how the driver had to dress. Secondly, he asked them why, and they all emphasized the superb engineering, why it was a logical decision to buy such a car, which he put down to the power of the advertising of BMWs to persuade them that it was better than the run-of-the-mill German car. Mm-hmm. And the third question he asked, what do they think about, how do they view other drivers of Series 3 BMWs? And he said, invariably, they admired their other drivers for the independence of their thought.
We're back to cats swimming again, aren't we?
Yes, yeah. We don't realize just how much influence. So if you want, you can see some areas of life where this has started. For instance, it does strike me that, governments for some time been trying to stop people drinking and driving. So we've had advertising about that. But the advertising we had used to, I think, emphasize the chance of getting caught and the penalties if you are caught. So logically, don't do it. Mm-hmm. Advertising now, I think, says doing it is socially unacceptable. Now, it hasn't stopped it completely, but what I think it has stopped is people boasting about doing it. Mm-hmm. I think if you do it and get away with it, you wouldn't necessarily confess that to other people, whereas I think in the past you might have. I think the message has got in. That's a socially unacceptable activity.
Yeah. No, it's interesting how that changes over time. And, there's probably a study somewhere of drink driving campaigns over the years and how they've changed and evolved. That would be worth looking at.
I think they realized they had to change because they weren't working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So speaking of changes because things aren't working, if we installed you at 10 Downing Street and put you in charge of government policy for entrepreneurship, what would the 2 or 3 either main changes or new things you would introduce, or what would you stop immediately to try and improve things?
I think various different levels of that answer. I mean, at the top level, we would promoting small business because we wanted more jobs, we wanted more small businesses. I think we need to stand back a bit and say, actually, we're doing that because of people. It isn't that the fundamental thing was to have a stronger economy. We wanted a stronger economy to help people. Now, helping people in the future is not necessarily always about growth. We increasingly realize we're living in a finite world with finite resources. So we've got to be clever about doesn't mean we can't do more with what we've got, but it isn't just, oh, we can burn more coal to get it or something. Mm-hmm. So we've got to look at sustainability, I think, more. So we've got to question about what we really want to do for people. And I think we were saying people needed jobs, so we need people to create jobs for them. Instead of, no, people need a life. Now they've engaged in work in order to generate resources for life, but they can do that in a variety of ways. So maybe we want to help them to be more enterprising in how they go about that. And enterprise doesn't mean you automatically start a thing we call a business. But if we if we want people to be more enterprising and to behave in that way, I think we need to make it the socially acceptable thing to do, instead of possibly a number of people feeling, through school, etc., they're being driven to do well at school in order to go to university, to get a good degree and to enter a good profession such as the law, medicine, something like that. That's what gets you a good salary and respectability. So that's what socially you're encouraged to do, instead of saying, no, we want people to think more widely, but it'll only come if they're comfortable within their social circles in doing that, rather than just because government makes it easier for you to do it. Making it easier to do it doesn't mean people want to do it.
Yeah, there's a big difference between the two, isn't there? That's for sure. What do you make of an American guy told me this once. He'd lived in the UK for a long time, and one of his recommendations to me, so he's telling the wrong person obviously, but one of his recommendations was about the bankruptcy system. And he said in America, in the UK, he said people view bankruptcy as a failure, and you get whacked with, I think it's a 7-year ban from being a director, and it's quite a draconian system. Which makes sense if you look back at the history of it. In America, I think it's a 1-year ban, maybe 2, and it's a lot more light touch than it is here, and it's not seen as a complete failure. It's very much I tried this, it didn't work, but now I know some more things and I can try again. Do you think do you see that cultural issue? Do you think there's some things that could be changed there to improve entrepreneurial results?
There's almost really 2 parts to think about that. First of all, yeah, I do want to raise the word failure. I think one way of putting it, we're using it for 2 different things. I think there are some things in life which are fairly predictable. The sequence of the seasons, the 24-hour cycle of the day is fairly predictable. If, for instance, you went out into a busy road without looking either way if traffic is coming and you were hit by a car, that is, you are to blame for not observing and predicting what's going to happen. You were at fault there. That clearly was a failure. But there are some things we said when looking at the future, we don't know what's going to happen. The only way to find out is to experiment. And if the experiment doesn't work, that we call that a failure. Actually, it's a successful experiment because we now know that doesn't work. But we've said the experiment failed. So we got a failure when it was your fault because you should have thought properly. Mm-hmm. And then we got the failure because you tried something and it didn't work. We call them both failure, and we fail to distinguish between the 2. So when we get a failure, we automatically assume it's the first sort, which is blameworthy, instead of recognizing, no, experiment is often trial and error is often the only way to work out what's going to happen. And we shouldn't call that the same failure as the first time, but we've got the same word for both things, so we confuse them.
Yeah.
So I think what he's saying is, in America, a business that didn't work, we should see that as an experiment, which unfortunately didn't work, but we now learned from it and we can do something different next time. However, if you failed to manage that business properly, and I'm using the failure in the first one, you should have watched the money and you didn't realize it was going so badly wrong that you were going bankrupt, then that is blameworthy. Mm-hmm. So I think it's distinguishing the two sorts of failure. So I think I'm not saying if we change the bankruptcy law here, it would make a lot of difference. I think if we could change the word failure for one of those, it would make a difference. So people realize trial and error is not the wrong way to proceed. Mm-hmm. We want to avoid the failure which we ought to be able to foresee, but we ought to engage in the experiment when we need to. But we do it in a safe way rather than ruining the business and going bankrupt. And only go so far as you invest in what you can afford to lose.
Exactly.
Running the business bankrupt is going beyond that.
No,
so I think bankruptcy possibly has an element of type 1 failure, but also an element of type 2, and we should distinguish between the two types.
As we both sat here in Northern Ireland, I'm thinking of an analogy with the rain. It always feels like a miss that we've only got one word for rain, when actually there's probably about 30 or 40 different types. And much the same with failure, there's different types and different reasons for it, and we probably should have a different word for each one. I just want to jump back right to the beginning of your career, because I think there was something you said a few minutes ago about having different thought and independent thought. And I think one of the things that maybe gets us into is diversity, and not just diversity in terms of gender or race, but diversity of thought and actions, and people who come from different backgrounds. So you mentioned you moved into the entrepreneurial field from working as an engineer, but before that you had a fascinating job as well, even though I think you said it maybe wasn't for you. You were in the Royal Engineers.
Yeah, well, it was for me for 7 years. But again, that's when I was being a bit of an engineer. I sort of haven't practiced much engineering since then, in a sense. I thought it was very useful, and gave me a number of very helpful experiences and some very helpful training. I think the military approach is often, its value is not recognized. Because people there have studied how people work in some very trying situations and try and equip them to make proper judgments in those situations. And I think that has a lot of validity elsewhere.
And you say about those judgments and external pressures, and I think we've talked previously about the impact of external pressures on business creation. Is it an external issue or an internal issue that's stopping people starting businesses? And I think you had some interesting thoughts, I think, on what might stop people from starting a business. I suspect it's social pressure. I'm not unless you've got the right encouragement, you may not even think that starting a business is for you. I think possibly less so now. There's a lot of emphasis on you could start a business, but certainly not that long ago. I think a lot of people, there were two possibilities. They were lucky enough to have a job, or they were unlucky and they're unemployed. Mm-hmm. The concept that you did it for yourself didn't, I think, occur to a number of people, because they were so used to people being in employment. Although historically, that has been a very short period of history, the contract of employment. A lot of people realized they were either self-sufficient or they were jobbing laborers. They had to find, the necessity was to find someone who would pay you for your labor somehow. But we then got the idea, unemployment benefit. It was a job or unemployment benefit, not on your own initiative going out and earning. So I think a lot of people don't see the possibility, or if they do, don't see it as being for them, possibly because, it's what's the matter? Couldn't you get a proper job? It's not what people they know are doing. It's that impact of social pressure. And I talk about the story you have to be able to tell yourself, as well as the story you can tell others. So, does it have that social credibility to say, I've started a business, or this is my business, or this is the size of my business? And there's a book by, I actually think he's called Paul Jarvis, I think it's about solopreneurs, which is a word I hate. but about championing the value in one person businesses. Not every business wants to scale to 20, 50, 2,000, 100,000 people. There's a lot about being able to tell that story confidently and not being apologetic for it's just me in the business. So you know those social pressures can be huge for people, not just in entrepreneurship though, is it? You know, it's in all walks of life, I suppose.
Oh yes, very much, yes.
Yeah. So we've talked about a number of books because we're coming up to the hour mark, so we're nearly there, unfortunately. But we've talked about a number of books that you've mentioned: Burned and Scale, Adapt, Anti-Fragile, Black Swan, and a few others. Links to all of these books are in the show notes. If you want to go and buy them, just click on them. It'll take you off to somewhere so you can go and buy them and have a read. But are there any other books that you would recommend to people if they're interested in more on this subject?
Well, there's a lot actually, but can't remember. But there was one because I just because we were talking about it earlier, I happened to have with me. It's called Seed to Seed. This goes back to my. I was asked about businesses wanting to grow all the time. This book is about a researcher who looked at a very small weed and looking at the DNA of the weed. And almost the starting assumption we had with plants was once a seed has germinated, it tries to grow. And if it's not growing very well, it must be because there's a lack of something external, like a lack of sunlight, a lack of water, a lack of nutrients. And if it's got all those, it will grow. But in researching the DNA of this little weed, he identified in its DNA several places where there was an inbuilt growth inhibitor. He also discovered that in certain circumstances, the plant produced a hormone which turned off the growth inhibitors. So when it turns off, it produces the hormone, the growth inhibitors are turned off and it grows. But he wondered, why is it otherwise inhibiting its growth? But he said, and this is why I like the book, he talks about the work he's doing in the laboratory, but it also talks about his walking from the laboratory to home and observing the weed growing in the wild. And it struck him, if the seed of this weed had landed in a piece of good earth, it grew quite large, produced lots of flowers, lots of seeds. If it landed somewhere, something like a middle of a path, it didn't grow large. It still matured. It still produced some flowers and some seeds, but it stayed small. And he realized what it's doing. If the path is normally very dry, if suddenly you had a rain shower, lots of water, it suddenly grew. Then when things dried up, it would die off. So it was limiting its size to what was sustainable where it was. So it was the plant with an inbuilt adjustment not to grow too big for its situation, as opposed to just growing as much as it can. Yeah. And he talks about that as something we ought to have for life. We shouldn't be brash and always try to grow. We should be, it's much more beneficial to life to limit what we're doing to the situation. So I think, again, for businesses, those very long-lasting businesses had not tried to grow big for their too big for their niche, and had lived a very long time as a result.
So that sounds fascinating.
Seed to Seed. I rather like that story because it upsets the assumption that in plants growth is inevitable, and I think we've almost applied the same thing to businesses.
So we're back to where we started, which is test every assumption, received wisdom, things that we know, that we think we know. We should test everything. I mean, that is kind of an unwritten motto of XMO marketing, is question everything, which I think might have been a Henry Ford line. I don't know, somebody, but not me. But I think it's a really important place to finish and to land on. So that's an important one. Thank you. So I've got my last question for you, the same one I ask everybody. Is there anything that you expected me to ask that I haven't?
No, well, one way you've just asked it. I thought I was wondering if you're going to ask about that. So, no, I think we've covered. Actually, I'm afraid I think we've covered all the. I've gone through quickly, and generally, I'm quickly thinking about how do I summarize what I've been doing very shortly? And I think I've covered the main areas. Yes. It's just been my experience that I think we have built a conventional wisdom about this area, which is now quite widely shared, but we really ought to question, because so I've identified, social influence is important. The future is uncertain. We ought to do much more to prepare people how to live in conditions and enjoy conditions of uncertainty. We ought to realize that a lot of people can be enterprising and not start businesses, be enterprising in different ways. Mm-hmm. And some of the things they do, it's almost, if we label it as a business, we treat it differently. I mean, a self-employed artist, we don't say they've got a business, but actually, in all respects, they have. But because we don't call it a business, we don't expect them to react in the same way. But if you can say I'm a self-employed artist, that's respectable. If you say I'm a one-person business, people say, oh, why?
It's a story you have to tell, isn't it? That's the...
Yeah. So I think we need to look at this in a different area from the purpose of the human being. And again, just to go back to business, it did seem to be one lecture I talked about described an enterprise as a goal realization device. In other words, having a business is not the goal. Mm-hmm. Having a business helps you to achieve your goal. What is your goal? And is it just money, or is it satisfaction? Is it helping other people? So your enterprise doesn't have to be just about money.
Yeah. Brilliant stuff. Brilliant. I love that. An enterprise, a goal realization device. I'm going to take that and clip it up and use it in the promotion of this podcast, Simon. That's the bit I'm taking right from the end. Wonderful stuff. Well, look, thank you very much for your time, Simon. It's been fascinating. We've covered policy, we've covered research, some interesting book recommendations, which is probably a wider reading list than most of the guests I've had on, which is fantastic, and a few I'm going to go off and buy now as well. So thank you very much for your time, and your details, if anybody wants to get in touch, are also in the show notes. And I suppose you're happy to hear from people if they're interested in the subject.
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful stuff. Well, no problem at all, Simon. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for your interest. Yeah. Good luck.